The alarm lights blinked frantically across the interior of the freighter as smoke curled through the cracked ventilation shafts. Control panels sparked and buzzed, while the ship groaned under its own weight, drifting through empty space like a wounded animal. The pilot's hands gripped the controls, slick with blood yet steady despite the tremor of failing hydraulics and flickering power grids. The ship's structure had held together longer than expected after the ambush, but it was clear now things were falling apart faster than repair systems could catch up. The pilot, a human freight runner named Dalen Rhodes, kept his gaze locked on the dim, flickering scanner. He ignored the sharp throb radiating from his shoulder and the damp warmth soaking through the side of his shirt. The computer's monotone voice announced one failure after another, listing hull breaches, oxygen loss, decompression risks, and power supply compromises. The voice sounded almost indifferent, as though it had given up trying to prevent catastrophe and was merely narrating the timeline of inevitable destruction. Through the smogged viewport, something shimmered in the distance, a medical station orbiting in a quiet void, far from any major trade routes. Its clean hexagonal design and pulsing blue beacon stood in stark contrast to the failing scorched hull of the Humans freighter. It was Kepler 7, a neutral zone facility renowned across multiple star systems as a sanctuary where medical aid transcended political conflict and species barriers. No questions asked, no judgments made. With dwindling consciousness and one eye nearly swollen shut, Dalen managed to align his crippled ship toward the emergency landing bay. His breath was shallow lungs rattling with strain, but he refused to let go. Panels popped loose and metal groaned in protest as the freighter scraped across the deck of Bay 3. It skidded on. Contact bounced once and came to a violent stop against the containment wall. The jolt twisted metal, shattered brackets, and finally subdued the ship into silence. Inside, Dalen remained slumped in his harness, blood crusting along his jaw, unmoving but alive. When the exterior hatch hissed open, the station's sterile atmosphere rushed inside, sweeping away the haze of burnt wires and metallic tang. A team of medical responders surged forward. They spoke in dialects not meant for human ears, their limbs and faces reflecting biologies built in alien worlds. At the center of the group stood a towering crystalline figure radiating a subtle blue glow, her form angular and graceful like sentient glass, her expression unreadable to the untrained eye. The team approached with a mix of urgency and caution, expecting fragility in the being they knew nothing about. Scans were performed before touch, and the results made several of them freeze mid-step. A cascade of alerts appeared across their instruments, trauma indicators lighting up in red bursts, internal fractures mapped in dizzying complexity, circulatory strain flickering like electrical storms. It was enough to provoke a wave of disbelief. The team lifted the human onto a hovering stretcher without resistance. The man's body, though battered, remained astonishingly stable. Despite multiple breaks across his ribs, arms, and legs, despite blood loss and neural strain, his vital signs pulsed with tenacity. His skin was pale, but his breathing rhythmic. One assistant whispered in hushed tones that no patient she had treated with more than 3 skeletal fractures had survived. This one, she said, bore at least a dozen, maybe more. They navigated the corridors quickly past towering machines and floating biolights through sterile fields and shimmering diagnostic chambers. As the human was brought into the central medical bay, the lead doctor began analyzing the preliminary scan data. Her internal processors struggled to reconcile the volume of damage with the subject's current consciousness and systemic balance. Her crystalline body flickered with color changes indicating escalating confusion. Every species in their database, the aquatic hrel, the photosynthetic draven, the dense muscled corton, would have long since succumbed to even a fraction of this trauma. The full scan revealed 17 distinct fractures across Dalen's skeleton. Some were clean breaks, others shattered pieces. 2 ribs were pressing dangerously close to vital organs, yet none had pierced or ruptured. One shoulder blade was split clean in 2, and both legs showed signs of compound fracturing with internal bruising and ligament strain. Still, his heart rate remained within functional range, and his brainwave activity, while registering as pained, remained coordinated and alert. For many moments, no one in the room said anything. They simply observed the data, then observed the man. Each reading compounded the absurdity. No sedatives had been administered, no regenerative serum, no neural stabilizers. The human's own body was doing the impossible, maintaining balance in chaos. More than one medical assistant suggested equipment malfunction. The diagnostics were rerun. Twice. The results remained the same. As they prepared him for intensive monitoring, a young xenobiologist arrived. His species, known for quadruple ocular vision and vast biological databases, accessed comparative charts and queried the human genome's known markers. He cross-referenced bone density, circulatory adaptation, pain response neuroreceptors, and skeletal microstructure. A pattern began to emerge. Not only were human bones significantly denser than standard species averages, but the stress fractures showed early signs of regenerative response within hours of trauma. The lead doctor remained silent for some time, arms crossed, her crystal form gently pulsing with contemplative light. She examined the medical history as best as it had been gathered from preliminary ship scans. Dalen's genetic code carried scars not just from this incident, but from dozens of earlier injuries. Healed breaks in both arms, a spinal misalignment partially repaired, microfractures along fingers and toes, deep tissue damage long since regenerated. His body was a living history of impact, injury, and healing. The implications became difficult to ignore. This was not a unique case of miraculous survival. This was perhaps typical. This was a biological design purpose-built not to avoid harm, but to recover from it. In her 2 centuries of practice, the lead physician had never encountered a being with such a relationship to damage. Most intelligent species evolved with physiological systems designed to prevent trauma at all costs. Their cultures developed technologies to preserve delicate forms. Even moderate injury often required complex intervention and months of recovery. Yet here was a creature from a warlike blue planet who seemed to treat catastrophic bodily damage as a manageable inconvenience. As the medical team worked, more specialists were summoned. They arrived in pairs and clusters, examining scans, drawing blood, analyzing cellular resilience. They whispered theories about environmental pressures on Earth, referencing Earth's gravity, the chaotic weather patterns, the biodiversity of its fauna, the unpredictable tectonic shifts. They postulated that only a species forged in a crucible of planetary hostility would develop bodies that expected to be broken and built the systems to survive it. Every new test result confirmed their suspicions. Human red blood cells carried oxygen with terrifying efficiency. Their clotting factor was hyper-responsive, stopping bleeding in seconds. Adrenaline pathways were both potent and remarkably non-degenerative, allowing sustained performance under stress without permanent damage. And perhaps most shocking of all, their tolerance for pain, measured against any known scale, was orders of magnitude higher than average. Several doctors found themselves unsettled by what they were learning. They had spent their careers understanding fragility as the defining trait of life. This human, broken, bleeding, and still breathing, challenged that doctrine. It redefined endurance. It demanded that pain not be viewed as failure, but as a threshold to be mastered. And then Dalen moved. Still unconscious, his hand twitched. His fingers flexed. The monitors flared slightly as his brain activity surged, but still he did not wake. One assistant theorized that he was attempting to turn in his sleep, perhaps instinctively seeking a position of comfort despite half his bones being compromised. The movement sent a quiet ripple of astonishment through the observers. It was as if this man, this resilient anomaly, had never learned to fear injury the way others had. Pain to him was not a signal of imminent death. It was merely something to endure, something to carry, something to conquer. Later that cycle, as reports spread throughout the station, researchers from distant wings began arriving. The medical bay became a locus of fascination, disbelief, and scientific curiosity. Charts were compared. Lectures were hastily composed. A dozen doctoral theses were outlined within hours. In the center of it all, Dalen Rhodes slept, his breathing steady, his body broken, his legend just beginning. 3 full rotations had passed aboard the station, and the medical bay remained under heightened observation protocols. Inside, Dalen Rhodes lay still on the examination bed, wrapped in layers of monitoring equipment. Hovering bioreaders tracked his vitals, displaying pulse, respiration, neural activity, and biochemical markers in soft pulses of holographic light. His body, though ravaged, was mending at a pace that refused to obey the known laws of trauma recovery. Data streamed constantly to the central core of Kepler-7's medical archives. Each hour brought more anomalies. The fusion of fractured bone segments was already underway. Microscopic analyses revealed calcium and collagen knitting together in robust lattice formations. The density of the newly forming bone exceeded standard regeneration metrics by a factor of 3. Even more disturbing to the attending physicians was the almost complete lack of pharmacological aid. Aside from baseline stabilization protocols, Dalen's body was doing everything itself. No regenerative serum, no synthetic cartilage enhancement, no hormonal amplification, just biology raw, untamed, and potent. While the crystalline chief physician meticulously cataloged every shift in the human's healing trajectory, a wave of disbelief was taking root across the galactic research community. Word of the broken human had begun to circulate through scientific networks. Files were shared, encrypted summaries forwarded. Specialists from multiple disciplines, xenobiologists, comparative anatomists, trauma engineers, all converged on one burning question. How could a species survive such violent insult to its structural framework and continue functioning? That question deepened when Dalen began to stir. His eyelids flickered, muscles twitched, and brainwave activity shifted from theta to alpha rhythms. Though his system bore unmistakable signs of systemic trauma, the markers for pain remained curiously muted. As the attending physicians prepared for what they assumed would be a difficult awakening, many expected an acute stress response, even panic. But none came. Dalen opened his eyes with the slow, groggy tension of a man waking from restless sleep rather than near-fatal injury. He blinked at the sterile lights, winced slightly, and simply adjusted his position. Internal alerts pinged rapidly. His ribcage wasn't aligned for motion, and neural pathways flared red across the monitoring arrays. Still, he moved, carefully, deliberately, as if he'd done this sort of thing before. The observation deck was silent as he flexed a hand and stretched the fingers. Each joint carried a history of microfracture. Scans from earlier cycles had shown that his knuckles and phalanges had endured repetitive stress over many cycles. His bones bore the silent story of a life marked by falls, impacts, compression, and healing. The joints had thickened. The muscles wrapped around them had become taut. He wasn't just surviving trauma, he had been shaped by it. In the records compiled by the station's Comparative Trauma Division, Dalen's case was unlike any previously encountered. Every alien species documented over the past 5 centuries carried certain biological redundancies. Extra organs, blood-clotting fail-safes, even specialized organs for shock resistance. But no species had demonstrated this, a body so capable of enduring repeated blunt trauma that it had essentially normalized injury. The conclusion was unthinkable to many in the field. Perhaps pain was not universally debilitating. Perhaps in some species it was a signal to adapt, not surrender. Over the following days, Dalen continued to recover in ways that upended every existing medical model. The physicians watched with growing awe as scar tissue diminished, inflammation receded, and muscle function returned without artificial stimulation. Nutrient supplements were offered, but his body had already begun metabolizing stored energy with ruthless efficiency. One physiologist, a silken-appendaged being from the planet Ulvan Prime, remarked that the human's recovery timeline should have spanned decades, not weeks. Another, a rigid-shelled academic from Torvus, refused to believe the numbers until she witnessed Dalen rotating his previously fractured shoulder with fluid precision. It had been 10 days since the crash. The only explanation that seemed plausible was evolutionary demand. Earth, the human homeworld, was known for its atmospheric unpredictability, tectonic volatility, and aggressive biosphere. It was a world that demanded resilience, not just to thrive, but to survive. The kind of planet where adaptation wasn't an option. It was the default state of being. The more the alien doctors learned about Earth, the more everything began to make sense. Archival research revealed gravity fields stronger than most habitable worlds, predatory species with complex hunting strategies, viruses that mutated faster than biological systems could develop immunity. The planet itself had undergone extinction-level events multiple times, yet life always returned. Earth wasn't nurturing. It was relentless, and it forged its apex species accordingly. Meanwhile, Dalen had begun participating in light physical therapy, Against the counsel of several researchers, he stood unsupported and began a regimen of movements. The act sent shockwaves through the room. His tibia, which had fractured in 3 places, should not have borne weight. His spine, recently stabilized by natural calcium deposition, should not have tolerated torsion. Yet he stood, walked, and even performed a few knee bends before the stunned audience. One attending physician described the moment as medically sacrilegious. And still Dalen showed no signs of internal distress. His body swayed with a mild stiffness, but carried none of the strain expected after such injury. Scans confirmed that the healing process had accelerated, seemingly catalyzed by the movement itself. Biomechanical analysis suggested that human tissue responded to physical stress by regenerating stronger than before. The physicians, already reeling from the implications, began drafting new models of musculoskeletal recovery models that hadn't existed 3 weeks ago. As news of Dalen's physiology spread beyond the medical fields, cultural scholars began to take notice. If the human body was built to recover from constant punishment, what did that imply about their civilization? What stories did they tell about strength, pain, and endurance? What rituals did they perform that embraced suffering as transformation? Cultural probes into human recreational behavior yielded staggering results. Records revealed activities known as contact sports, combat disciplines, and extreme exploration. These weren't fringe behaviors. They were normalized, celebrated. Children were introduced to competitive physicality before reaching maturity. Entire industries revolved around professional feats of exertion, injury, and recovery. For most galactic species, pain was the end of the equation, something to be avoided or cured. For humans, it was a process. It became clear that Dalen wasn't an outlier. He was representative of a species that had turned adversity into instinct. Even his casual interactions with the medical team reflected an attitude that bordered on nonchalance. He moved with an ease that defied the solemnity of his circumstances, as if his body weren't a catalog of fractures but merely a temporary inconvenience. Some theorized that human culture had co-evolved with their biology, each feeding the other. Bodies built to recover invited lifestyles, built to test those limits. Every broken bone became a badge, not a warning. Every scar a lesson. Their media glorified survival. Their myths centered around struggle. Even their heroes were defined by what they had endured, not what they had avoided. As the days passed, Dalen's physiology became the subject of an unprecedented multidisciplinary study. Hundreds of pages of documentation poured into the Galactic Medical Council's archives. Conferences were called. Protocols were rewritten. Training manuals adjusted. Species that had once feared moderate trauma now looked toward human biology as a benchmark of possibility. But for Dalen, none of this seemed particularly extraordinary. He followed the therapy protocols without complaint. He answered anatomical questions as best he could. He allowed samples of blood, hair, skin, and bone marrow to be extracted for analysis. He asked only one thing in return: that they let him get back to work once he was able. Work to Dalen was hauling freight through dangerous star systems, maneuvering past asteroid fields, landing on unstable terrain, repairing hulls under pressure. Risk was not something he avoided, it was something he budgeted for, a variable in the life equation. The same way others prepared for weather or hunger, he prepared for damage. By the end of the 3rd week, Dalen was jogging short laps through the rehabilitation corridor. He no longer relied on stabilizers. His vitals were not only normal, they were optimal. His musculoskeletal scans showed enhanced density at the healed fracture sites. His respiratory efficiency had increased. His pain receptors had desensitized to injury-specific triggers. And in that moment, the physicians realized something profound. Dalen's recovery wasn't just an anomaly, it was a template, a blueprint for a new philosophy of resilience, a path to reimagine the relationship between damage and growth. And at the center of that revelation stood a man who had survived 17 broken bones and called it a Tuesday. By the 4th week, the medical facility had transformed from a sanctuary of recovery into a global hub of academic obsession. Kepler-7 was no longer simply tending to the wounded, it was now the epicenter of a movement. The human had done more than survive. He had redefined the parameters of survivability. The Central Archives recorded the entire trajectory of Dalen Rhodes's treatment. Every scan, every micro-adjustment in bone alignment, Every uptick in clotting performance or neural pathway reconfiguration was logged in real time. Cross-reference data comparisons revealed that even the rate of muscle regeneration on the human exceeded the limits previously accepted by multi-species medical doctrine. Yet beyond the biology, something more intangible was beginning to take hold across the station and in distant research centers tuning into the feeds. It was a sense of unease, a recognition, a quiet collective realization that perhaps the sentient species of the galaxy had misunderstood a fundamental truth, that survival as they knew it was a fragile compromise. For most civilizations, life had been lived with caution. Institutions were designed around risk mitigation, not risk adaptation. Injury was equated with error and pain with failure. But Dalen's scarred, limping stretching and quietly chuckling at his discomfort embodied something else. He was not merely a survivor of trauma, he was familiar with it, unshaken by it, even defined by it. And this familiarity gave rise to a radical idea that began circulating among researchers. What if true intelligence wasn't about avoiding harm, but learning to exist with it? That question sparked waves of reevaluation. Curriculums were torn apart, philosophies rewritten. What once was seen as biological recklessness in human behavior now bore the hallmarks of a sophisticated evolutionary strategy. The alien scientists slowly began to piece together a larger picture. Resilience was not a byproduct of strength. It was a culture, a value system, an entire ecosystem of shared beliefs and collective endurance. Outside the confines of the lab, Dalen had resumed light strength training. The medical team watched with cautious fascination as he added weight to his movements, testing the repaired limbs as though searching for fault lines. But there were none. The femur, that had once splintered, was now reinforced by naturally thickened bone. The shoulder that had been split into fragments now rotated smoothly, its rebuilt tissue humming with adaptive density. Perhaps even more astonishing was Dalen's reaction to all of it. Where others might have marveled at miraculous healing, he simply adjusted his posture, wiped his brow, and asked when his ship would be cleared for launch. He didn't revel in his recovery, he expected it. And this expectation shook the foundation of everything the alien doctors believed. The philosophical wing of the station launched a secondary analysis to accompany the medical one. They studied ancient Terran literature, diving deep into centuries-old texts and oral traditions. From those accounts, a thread began to emerge. Pain had always been present in human narratives, not as an end, but as a forge. Heroes were not those who avoided injury, but those who endured and grew through it. Even more astonishing were the cultural practices unearthed during their research organized combat sports, where participants deliberately placed themselves in harm's way. Obstacle courses designed to punish and challenge the body. Ceremonial rites involving physical hardship to mark transformation or maturity. All of it painted a picture of a species that did not flee from damage but ritualized it. What baffled researchers further was the social acceptance of these risks. Parents on Earth encouraged children to play games that included physical contact, falls, bruises, and even minor fractures. Schools treated sprains as ordinary occurrences. Athletic injuries were normalized, even celebrated. This was not madness. It was an ethos, a consensus agreement that pain was part of growth, not evidence of weakness. Such thinking was alien, almost heretical to most galactic societies. For them, the body was sacred and sacrosanct, not to be marred or stressed unnecessarily. Medical technology in those civilizations had developed not to repair damage, but to prevent even the possibility of it. Entire architectural styles had evolved to minimize slips, falls, or sudden motion. Transportation systems were designed around zero-impact movement. Most alien children reached adulthood without ever experiencing a broken bone. Dalen, by contrast, had carried more fractures through adolescence than most beings had seen in their lifetimes. The deeper the council dug, the more they uncovered a disturbing trend. Humans, even from childhood, were conditioned to push their physical limits. Not all survived. But those who did emerged stronger, more prepared for an unpredictable world. Earth's evolutionary demands had not only shaped physiology, but sculpted psychology. Resilience was not a trait, it was a survival mechanism hardwired into their development. One alien xenopsychologist wrote in her findings that humans appeared to form a cooperative contract with suffering. They accepted it as part of the cost of progress, and in return, they developed the tools, mental, emotional, physical, to carry it. Such a concept had never been observed in other species. Within the medical wing, the findings continued to defy expectations. The scan data now revealed a phenomenon known as supercompensation, where Dalen's body, once stressed by trauma, overcorrected during healing and built denser, more resilient tissues. This wasn't merely recovery, it was enhancement. And it wasn't surgical, it wasn't synthetic, it was simply human. One researcher suggested that the entire human body operated under a principle of stress resistance feedback. In other words, pain initiated growth. Wounds sparked evolution. Damage was not dysfunction, it was instruction. As Dalen completed yet another set of physical trials, watched by a crowd of researchers in silent awe, his heart rate barely budged. The readouts showed coordinated efficiency, muscular harmony, skeletal load-bearing optimization. It had only been 5 weeks. A species from Kepler-7's own moon would have needed artificial exoskeletal scaffolding for mobility, even with advanced regeneration. Dalen asked for nothing beyond a timeline for his release. He made few demands. He offered no boast. And that perhaps unsettled the medical staff more than anything else. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't luck. This was what humans were. The consequences rippled outward. Medical students on distant stations began incorporating human biology into their coursework. Emergency response teams began cross-training on human injury models. Xenobiology think tanks reclassified human resilience from anomalous to species-defining. Soon, murmurs of cultural adaptation began to rise. Some alien youth inspired by the human model began experimenting with structured challenges. Simple things at first: gravity simulations, endurance training, calculated exposure to mild discomfort. Their mentors protested, citing risk. But the data spoke louder than tradition. The human had proven that suffering could be informative. That fear of harm was not the same as wisdom. That to insulate life from all discomfort was to miss the very purpose of life itself. And in the middle of this silent cultural revolution, Dalen simply finished his morning routine, rewrapped the bandage on his hand, and returned to the observation deck. He stared out into the void, watching the stars shift slightly with the station's rotation. His posture was relaxed, his breathing steady. His body, once broken, was whole. But the galaxy he had entered, it would never be the same again. 6 weeks had passed since Dalen Rhodes crashed into the docking bay of Kepler-7, his body torn apart and barely breathing. Now he walked without assistance, his spine aligned, his stride firm, his expression casual. The corridors that once echoed with the urgency of his arrival now fell silent as he passed, not from fear, but reverence. To the staff and researchers of the station, he had become a symbol not merely of recovery, but of reconsideration. Entire departments had shifted their directives. Regenerative medicine was now being redefined with human physiology as its template. Species once resigned to passive recuperation were studying active healing responses, skeletal overcompensation, adaptive hypertrophy, and the psychological frameworks that accompanied such resilience. But even as the science evolved, what most unsettled the observers was how utterly unshaken Dalen remained by the gravity of his influence. He awoke each morning and performed exercises that would have broken the average patient still in convalescence. He accepted new scans, tissue extractions, and observational interviews without complaint. When questioned about past injuries, he simply recalled them with faint amusement, noting the worst of them like landmarks in an old story. He did not speak of pain as torment, but as texture, an inconvenient but familiar part of existence. To those who had never known suffering as anything but a warning, this was a revelation that bordered on heresy. The more researchers learned, the more their certainty began to unravel. Pain, once seen as an absolute negative, now required reclassification. Human psychology had reframed it not as a deterrent, but as a dialogue. It wasn't that they didn't feel it. Dalen's scans showed he registered every fracture and tear, but they did not collapse beneath its weight. Instead, they seemed to metabolize it, integrate it, and continue onward. A team from the Galactic Cognitive Research Institute launched an observational meta-study on human neurochemistry. They found that humans produced a complex sequence of chemicals following injury, not just endorphins and dopamine for relief, but regulatory compounds that modulated fear responses and rebalanced emotional states. In essence, their brains were equipped with mechanisms to accept pain and keep functioning in spite of it. Other species, even those considered neurologically advanced, showed no such ability. Their systems initiated full physiological panic at far lower thresholds, neural shutdowns, systemic shock, involuntary collapse. In contrast, humans endured pain not because they lacked sensitivity, but because they had developed an entire inner architecture to process it differently. The implications staggered every field of study: physiology, psychology, pedagogy, even ethics. What responsibility did a society have if pain was no longer inherently bad? What happened when suffering no longer signaled weakness, but growth? And all the while, Dalen stretched, lifted, trained, and asked when his ship would be ready. Eventually it was. The Blaze Runner. His scarred and patched freighter had been repaired. Its hull bore the fresh sealant of restructured alloys. Its engines had been rebuilt with the help of engineers eager to keep him close just a little longer. They had added a few safety modifications over Dalen's indifference, but ensured it flew smoother than before. The day of departure came without ceremony, but the corridors swelled with quiet onlookers. The medical staff gathered at the dock. Researchers held tablets tight to their chests, some still unable to process what this human had meant to their work. Security agents stood at a distance, pretending not to be curious. Others, patients recovering from more minor injuries, peeked from the mezzanine, inspired by the myth walking on two once-shattered legs. The chief physician met him at the airlock. Her crystalline body pulsed softly in hues of pale violet and warm white tones the staff had come to associate with emotional complexity. She held a small black data capsule in her hand. Inside it was the full compilation of the Kepler-7 Human Study, 3,000 pages of scanned biometrics, blood work, thermal graphs, cellular regeneration patterns, comparative physiology, and psychological annotations. It was the most comprehensive study of human resilience ever attempted in galactic history. She handed it to him without flourish, and he accepted it with a nod, slipping it into his pack as casually as if it were a ration bar. Then he stepped into his ship, paused, and looked back. Not to say goodbye, but to look into the eyes of beings who had witnessed something they still struggled to name. He saw gratitude. He saw confusion. But most of all, he saw awe. When the ship disengaged from the station and slipped into the dark, the silence lingered. For the physicians left behind, life did not return to normal. It couldn't. Already messages were arriving from research institutions across the galaxy. The findings from Kepler-7 were igniting debate, innovation, and in some cases, cultural unrest. Worlds where life had been shielded behind protocols were now questioning whether they had gone too far in protecting themselves from the very friction that shaped resilience. Some species rejected the implications, entirely labeling the human phenomenon as dangerous aberration. Others embraced it, seeing in Dalen Rhodes a glimpse of what evolution might look like if pain was no longer feared. One educational district on a temperate moon announced a new curriculum that included calibrated adversity challenges designed to build tolerance, encourage growth, and simulate the human approach to physical learning. Parents protested, philosophers argued, yet the idea spread. Back on Earth, Dalen resumed his work. He filed no report about Kepler-7. He told no grand story. He simply flew his routes, fixed his engines, delivered his cargo, and kept a small black capsule locked in a secure drawer in his bunk. Occasionally, when storms battered his ship or turbulence rattled the hull, he would smile because the chaos outside felt like home. And sometimes he'd receive encrypted transmissions, questions about bone density inquiries into pain recovery requests for interviews. He ignored most of them. He didn't see what the fuss was about. He had lived through worse. And that more than anything else was the truth that had shaken the stars. The most remarkable thing about the indestructible human wasn't what he survived, but how unremarkable he thought it was. Months passed. The ripples from Kepler-7's impossible case continued to fan outward, sweeping through medical faculties, galactic cultural forums, and philosophical roundtables, like an ancient wind awakening dust-covered truths. What began as a quiet anomaly, one man with 17 broken bones and no fear in his eyes, had become the most referenced medical case in the last 2 centuries. Across dozens of worlds, lectures now began with Dalen Rhodes's scans. Animated holographs of his skeletal trauma floated in classrooms beside textbook definitions of biological limits. Students studied the fractures as if they were sacred texts, not because of their severity, but because of their bearers' indifference. Entire institutions redrafted their understanding of resilience, no longer defining it as the avoidance of damage, but the mastery of its aftermath. And the word human itself took on new connotations. It no longer meant fragile carbon being from a violent blue planet. It meant the one who stands back up, the one who moves forward, the one who repairs. But Dalen wasn't aware of the curriculum revisions or the research symposiums named in his honor, or the biomechanical training protocols labeled Rhodesian endurance scales. He was back in deep space alone, guiding his freighter through asteroid belts and solar shears, doing what he'd always done, hauling goods through dangerous routes others preferred to avoid. The data capsule remained where he'd placed it, untouched. Its contents were being pored over by thousands, but to Dalen, its significance never changed. It was simply a record of something he'd lived through, something he considered normal, something that hadn't required heroism, only persistence. Back on Kepler-7, life resumed with a hum of purpose, though not as it was before. The chief physician, now heading an expanded multidisciplinary division, led efforts to integrate human-adapted protocols into broader emergency care. Medical designs began incorporating variability allowances. AI trauma prediction models were adjusted to reflect that survival was no longer an absolute scale. It was species-dependent, culturally embedded, and deeply personal. Her notes from Dalen's treatment evolved into a doctrine that a sentient being's capacity to heal was not just biological, but philosophical, and that no scan could ever account for the quiet decision to endure. More remarkable still was the ripple in behavior. Among species once risk-averse by nature, young explorers emerged curious about their limits, intrigued by the thought that discomfort was not disaster. Training academies introduced new programs based on controlled exposure to environmental stress. Students walked longer distances, carried heavier loads. Some even took up primitive climbing rituals on low-gravity moons, mimicking Earth's mountain traditions in slow, careful steps. In one notable case, a class of ventralid scholars descended from a species that once considered skin bruising a civic emergency designed a research program centered on voluntary challenge. Their instructors protested. The administration resisted. But the students persisted, citing the Rhodes Papers, noting that strength was not the absence of harm, but the willingness to meet it. Meanwhile, Dalen kept moving. He repaired his ship's systems with grease-stained fingers and hoisted containers with joints that still carried phantom aches. He charted routes through unstable corridors of space and corrected nav errors mid-jump. Sometimes he got scratched. Sometimes he limped. But he always kept going. He began rock climbing in silence alone on an isolated moon near the edge of the Promethean Drift. Its jagged cliffs reminded him of the broken edges of the station's diagnostic screens back when 17 red lines traced across his bones. Now his muscles pulled clean and strong, scar tissue flexing in harmony with hardened sinew. At the summit, he once took a photograph. Not for ego, not for proof, just for the silence. Just for the memory of pain that once threatened to unravel him and never did. He sent it to Kepler-7. There, in the observation wing, the crystalline chief physician received it. The image showed Dalen hanging from a rock face, muscles straining, face calm, mouth curled in the faintest smile. No caption, no analysis, just the truth quietly offered. She held it up to the light, her body pulsing in colors too complex to be named. It was not the photo that moved her, it was what it meant. That the human had not changed his life after the trauma. He had resumed it. And that perhaps was the final lesson. The difference between healing and wholeness wasn't found in laboratories or in surgeries or even in resilience metrics. It was in how a being chose to carry what had broken them. For Dalen Rhodes, pain had never been the enemy. Fear had never been the obstacle. Survival had never been the goal. Living, truly living, was the only thing that mattered. And as the stars turned above him, silent and ancient, he kept climbing. And so the story of Dalen Rhodes came to an end not with fanfare or ceremony, but with quiet strength and unwavering steps. His legacy was not forged through grand speeches or heroic battles, but through endurance, recovery, and a refusal to let pain define him. Across the galaxy, his name became synonymous with resilience, but to him, it was just life. If this story moved you, if it made you question what true strength means, or reminded you that healing is its own form of courage. Consider supporting the channel. Subscribe to follow more stories about what makes us human, even when the universe calls us something else.